All right. How's it going, everybody? My name is Ramirez. I am a team member of Craft Cultura, and today we are discussing Dia de los Muertos on this episode of Borderlands and Beyond. And with me today is a good friend of mine, William Escalante. Will, do you want to introduce yourself?
How you doing? I'm Will Escalante, and I've known Christian since graduate school. We were in graduate school together in the Sociology and Chicano Latino Studies Department at Michigan State University. I currently work in higher ed. I live in Chicago, and I'm just really excited to be able to kind of participate in this podcast and this conversation about, Chicano culture and the Day of the Dead holiday in the United States.
Yeah, and I just want to first and foremost give an acknowledgement to the land space that I'm in right now, currently in South Texas. This is the ancestral land of Coahuiltecan and Carancawa people, and so we want to give that sort of. We want to honor that we are on indigenous land, and because we are discussing Dia de los Muertos, it's only right to connect those ancestral roots, past, present, and future. And so, yeah, like Will said, we met in graduate school, and this is when it was a predominantly white institution, and so finding other Latinos in those spaces is pretty tough, just in general. And so one of the cool things about Will is that I found out like he was doing research on Dia de los Muertos, and so when Craft Cultura came to us and said, we're coming up on this holiday, do you mind doing an episode or a podcast sort of thing on Dia de los Muertos? You were the first person that came to mind, Will. So my first question to you, man, is
Thank you, man.
What has been your personal experience with Dia de los Muertos, and how did you come to see it as like a viable research project for yourself?
So the personal experience that I had, the first idea that comes to mind is when I was married. This is something that was very important to my ex-wife, and she was from Mexico. She was from at the northern Mexico, and we started to celebrate Dia de los Muertos in our home. She would cook some food. We'd build an altar. We would put up the pan de muertos. We would do some of the very typical and traditional things that she was familiar with. And this was even though this wasn't a holiday that I grew up with, this was something that really kind of resonated with me as an opportunity to celebrate the lives of our loved ones who are no longer with us in a material way, in a material world. And so that we started doing that, and then I started wondering, are other people doing this? Are other Mexican Americans, are the Chicanos celebrating this holiday in the same way, or how are they celebrating it in the same way? And I was aware that there had been things done in museums and universities and community centers, and that there was a part of the Chicano movement in the 60s and the 70s that was part of cultural reaffirmation for Chicanos, and that these types of holidays were a part of that cultural claiming and that creation of space for Chicanos and Latinos. And so I began to get interested in how does this help us understand who we are, and how does this inform our identity as Latinos? And one of the things that she said once was that it was really important for her to celebrate these holidays, like more so when she was living in the United States, because in Mexico it was really easy to remember that you were Mexican. In Mexico, everything's Mexican, and in the States, particularly in the Midwest where we were living at the time, there's not a lot, or there wasn't a lot, and there still is not a lot that is Mexican that allows you to remember that you are Mexicano or Mexicana. And when there is, it's definitely not, or not necessarily, part of the mainstream. And I guess that was my entryway into looking at Dia de los Muertos as an example of cultural creation, an example of identity creation, an example of how people who have migrated away from their homelands are recreating their sense of self in new social realities.
Yeah, and so you bring up geography, which is super important. And I know that you've lived in lots of different social spaces. From the time that I've known you, you were living for one time in Las Vegas, I
Right.
remember, then
Yeah,
back to
yeah,
the Midwest in Michigan, but you're also from Wisconsin. And
right,
so because you have and you've also like spent some time in Monterrey, right? And so you have
right.
this really cool understanding of different geographies, and they've informed your understanding of Dia de los Muertos. So can you tell us what Dia de los Muertos looks like in the Midwest compared to, the time that you might have spent in Mexico or in Vegas, which is in the Southwest? What does Dia de los Muertos look like in a Midwestern space?
So let's see, how do I want to start this? In Monterrey, when I was there, I didn't actually experience any Dia de los Muertos, celebration. So I'm just going off of what was shared with me about what people did in Monterrey, and I think this is confirmed in some of the interviews that I did as part of the project. In Monterrey, what I was told was that the prime thing that families did was families got together and they went to the cemeteries where their loved ones were buried. And there was, some time together. They may have shared a meal or at least some type of food. They definitely cleaned and decorated, grave sites, which I think is a pretty common practice throughout Latin America when it comes to the celebration of this holiday. In the Midwest, what's interesting is the folks who I interviewed, and I think for a lot of folks who come from, have a migrant background, their relatives aren't buried in the Midwest. It's also not, Halloween is on the 31st of October. And if you're Catholic, you celebrate All Saints, All Souls Days on November 1st and 2nd. However, we don't get time off. There's no long weekend. US life does not stop for these holidays. In some places, it's not even really recognized. And so people were finding ways to do things outside of this kind of mainstream, organization or recognition of the holiday. And people would celebrate things in their homes. So they would build altares in their homes. They would either buy some pan de muerto or they would make pan de muerto. And so they would have that in their homes. Like I said, my ex-wife and I, we built an altar, every year. There was where I was living, there was a church, and there was like an events planning committee. And one of the things that the events planning committee did was they would build an altar in the entryway of the church. And then, church members could bring pictures of their loved ones who passed away, and they would put them on this altar, and they could put the photos on the church. The names of the deceased would be read at during the mass, and then those pictures would stay up for until Thanksgiving, I think, if I remember correctly. The other thing that you see in the Midwest, and this kind of waxed and waned a little bit with popularity. Like sometimes it would get really popular. You would see altares being built in libraries and on college campuses. Mm-hmm. And those were did I say libraries? Mm-hmm. Museums, libraries, and college campuses, excuse me. And those weren't inherently public. This is a place for people who aren't necessarily family members, or people who aren't necessarily the builders of the altar to like witness and experience. And so you had those that would take place in a very public fashion. And in some cases, some of those were geared towards recognizing people who were deceased, or people who were connected to some sort of political or cultural or social issue. So you had at one altar, they were remembering, folks who had died as a result of homophobia. Mm. There were altares that were connected to the deaths in Juarez, the femicides in Juarez. There were altares that were connected to, migration stories. And so those were some of the things that I think we saw in the research there. And then the other thing is I just want to, for Chicago currently, the National Museum of Mexican Art every year does Dia De Los Muertos celebration. They call it Love Doesn't Die. And just like our family members, they might not be alive with us in a physical sense, our love for them doesn't cease. And so it's, I think it's a nice way of having kind of a party. They have, they have music, they have cocktails, they have events for the kids during the day. So it's definitely like a family oriented event.
Yeah, and I think for Chicago, more importantly, there's the population. They have the raza, they have the people to
they definitely do,
right?
Yeah.
So there's lots of Latinos, lots of not only just Mexicans, but lots of Central American, Caribbean family members that also participate in Dia de los Muertos. And so, one of the really cool things about your research that I remember from grad school was that you were using Dia de los Muertos, but you were using it as sort of like a vehicle to talk about Latino identity and cultural reproduction. And so can you help us, the audience, sort of connect the dots between how does Dia de los Muertos actually help us as a Latino population? How does it help us gain a sense of self, a sense of place? So what does it tell us about Latino identity?
One of the things I think it says about Latino identity is that it's dynamic. And that just like human beings and our culture is dynamic, it's constantly changing, one. Two, and this was kind of my case, is I was trying to push back against some of the typical assimilation theories regarding how immigrants are incorporated into US society. And a lot of it focuses on people kind of losing culture and people becoming so integrated into the quote unquote mainstream that you're indistinguishable. And one of the things that I was kind of trying to say was that people don't lose who they are. They're recreating who they are in a new space with the assets that they have around them. And so it's not possible for human beings to recreate their culture as a carbon copy, mere image of what it was from their place of origin. Social reality is different. The cultures that the mainstream cultures of this new country are different. The materials like the food and the types of foods they have access to are different. Growing up in the Midwest, I mean, there was one place to get good corn tortillas in like Madison, and they weren't even from a place in Wisconsin. They were from Chicago. It was, I grew up eating the El Milagro tortillas because that's what was available, and they're great. Anyways, so people are recreating their culture with what they have, and Dia de los Muertos is an example of how, even though maybe you don't have a cemetery where your family members are buried that you can go visit, maybe there's beyond a very personal or spiritual aspect to this. There's an option of hey, I want to create a space for my community. I want to create a space for my family and my friends in a very real way. And then I think the other thing about human beings that we don't always remember sociology is that we're all dynamic and we're all making choices and we're thinking things through and we're trying to rationalize and make sense of our realities. And I know when I lived in Mexico, I was trying to figure out how do I navigate this. And I don't mean that. I just, how do I get on the bus? Where's the bus? Do I put my hand up like this? Do I put my hand out like this? Like, what do I do? And so it's the same. It's just the same story for Mexicanos and other folks from Latin America who have come to the United States, and particularly in the Midwest, where there has not historically been a large Latino or a large Mexicano population. How are we making sense of ourselves in this new space? And that's what I titled, part of my paper was, the recreation of self in a new space. And one of the things that I argued and that I'll still argue is that we use these types of holidays and these types of cultural creations to produce our identity, to create our identity, to make sense of who we are, and to reaffirm who we are as individuals, but also as it connects to a culture and a cultural community.
Right. And so this is really a really interesting point that you bring up, that as Latinos, as a Latinx population, as Mexicanos, Chicanos, we're constantly doing this this process of cultural reproduction that you were mentioning. And at the same time, there is this other sort of institution or mechanism that picks up on our cultural makings and our cultural
Mm-hmm.
things that we make, like Dia de los Muertos. And then it wraps it up and commercializes it, right? Like it creates an industry out of it. And so now we have Dia de los Muertos bar crawls, we have Dia de los Muertos arts and craft nights. Like there's different avenues that, you know, Dia de los Muertos has now been packaged for the dominant mainstream. And I'm thinking like Coco, like the Walt Disney film, right? Pixar or whoever made that,
Mm-hmm.
DreamWorks. But it, on the one hand, exposes children to this holiday and all of its sort of magical elements. But Disney's making bank off of that, right? Like they're making their money, and really the holiday belongs to indigenous peoples. It belongs to a culture of Latin America and the people in the United States who are reproducing it in a very real, sentimental, authentic sort of way. And so, how do you view Dia de los Muertos in its commercial sense, and the way that the U.S. is sort of like picking that up and extrapolating some of those cultural elements to make money?
So I think the first thing that I'll say is that I think it shows the growth and the economic or the consumer power or the financial power of a Latino market. And whether that's just population growth, whether we're all doing better financially, I'm not sure. I remember growing up in the Midwest in the 80s and the 90s, and there was minimal Latino culture in mainstream media. There was minimal Chicano culture in mainstream media. It was hard to find. So I think that as we're seeing more and more things permeate the mainstream, it shows that, you know, Latinos are very influential culturally, and that we're here, and that we have a market, that we have a buying power. You know, there's a book that I read a long time ago called Hispanic Incorporated, and it kind of talked about, you know, the marketing strategies of corporations going into, you know, focused towards Latinos, and how, you know, this market research had shown that, you know, Latinos they watch movies more than other groups, et cetera, and so there's money to be made there, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that in some ways, some of the things that I've heard about people's experiences with Dia de los Muertos was being, you know, things like, yo, those were the most expensive flowers we ever bought, you know, and, you know, or again, buying the pan de muertos at the bakeries, and they're decorating the storefront, you know, storefront windows as, you know, this is a time. And so there's those aspects of commercialization. I don't think that's what you're getting at, but I just want to kind of point this out. So I think one, it's this example of Latinos entering the mainstream, and I think it's an example of some maybe savvy business folks who are saying, hey, we can make some money here. And, you know, my experience, I spoke with Chico a little bit, and he kind of shared with me about some of the bar crawl or parties that take place in San Antonio around this time. And that was something that I wasn't aware of. When I was doing this project, somebody sent me a link to a Day of the Dead bar crawl in Ferndale, Michigan. And the photos that they had posted on this website from, I think it was like a local newspaper or something, looked basically like a Halloween party. And so the question then to me there becomes, are we just using this as like a new cultural chic way of celebrating Halloween? Because that's not what the holiday is. It's not Mexican Halloween. It's its own conception. It's its own holiday. it's not just the Mexican version of an American holiday, right? So
Yeah,
I think there's kind of that caveat there. And then the last thing I'll say is before we go is, the last thing I'll say here when we get to this is I think there's a difference in commercialization, which is part of it. There's also a difference in cultural hegemony and cultural appropriation. And each of these things kind of we could look at Dia de los Muertos and kind of begin to have conversations about each of these things. The cultural hegemony is the powers, who has the power structure to say this is mainstream in popular culture and this is not. And if we look at it from this perspective, there are aspects of Latino culture that the United States really likes and loves. Mexican food, for example. Mm-hmm. You see a lot of different, and it's, Mexican food, and we see all these Latin fusion restaurants and these Mexican inspired restaurants are doing all these different kinds of things with tacos. They're having all these different types of salsas. Taco Tuesday is just about as, you could go anywhere in the country and talk about Taco Tuesday and everybody's gonna know what you're talking about. Margaritas and these types of things are all very much seem to come out of Mexico. And, holidays are the same, holidays are kind of becoming the same way in that, well, this is really cool. This is fun. This looks like fun. We get to paint our faces. We get to go and have a party. And well, we already like margaritas. We already like tacos. So why not this? And then at the same time, we're stopping people at the border and we're separating families. We're locking kids in cages. And I say we as the United States, and we're still exploiting migrant farm labor. We're still exploiting migrant farm labor. We're still relying on these folks in the middle of a pandemic to keep, picking vegetables and slaughtering and processing our animals so that way we can still eat. And so we're really enjoying what a community produces without really valuing, the community, or with even demonizing that community. And
also misinterpreting what the meaning of Dia de los Muertos sometimes. So I know we had talked about this, a while back, about how in the US, Dia de los Muertos, looking back 20, 30, 40 years from now, there was a misconception that Mexicans were celebrating death, that we were celebrating something evil. And so can you talk about how death is viewed from a Western paradigm compared to, how Dia de los Muertos is really talking about death, but in a different sense that isn't like the end, but is something, it has a different orientation to what we in the West understand as death as being sort of, lights out, this is it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a religious scholar I am not. So we can step into the kind of these very, very big spiritual questions, religious questions. I'm kind of at the edge of my growing up in the United States. I think, death is something that's very scary.
Yeah.
And thinking of something as, even from like a Christian paradigm, you go to heaven, but you're no longer here. Death is seen as very finite. And then, and I think with everything around Halloween and kind of the mystique of that holiday here in the United States, ghosts are scary, spirits are scary. You go around and you look at decorations and it's skeletons and like it's very ominous and it's, they're going to get you, or these types of things. And it's not to say that there's that. And one of the things that I really fell in love with about Dia de los Muertos was that it was the celebration of the life of your loved ones. And the emphasis was, the emphasis was celebrating the time that you had with them. And, there is or people shared that there was a superstition or there was a belief, a number of years ago as it started, was that this was the time where your relatives could come back. This was the time of year that people could come back. And so you built an altar to help them find their ways. The cempasúchil flowers had a smell that was supposed to attract your relatives. The candles and the incense, the copal incense, was supposed to, again, help them find their place to you. You cooked the pan de muerto, was something they could eat. you cooked food that they liked. This was the celebration of them coming back. You know, you put out some soap and a little towel and some water and a mirror so that they could get ready, because this is a party. So you think, well, this is a party. Well, yeah. Hey, if my grandparents could come back and spend the weekend with us, we would have a party.
Absolutely.
Right? So yeah, it's a celebration of life. It's this, yeah, it's sad they're no longer here. It's also a celebration of all of the good times that we had. So when you think about it, well, why are they being so happy on the Day of the Dead? I think if you're focusing on dead and the death, I think you're kind of missing the point of the holiday. And so yeah, people paint their faces, and you see little kids having fun, and you see people smiling and laughing. You're, in a spiritual sense, you're communing with your family. You're communing with the ancestors. You're communing with people who have died, and that sounds like a good time to me. And I guess that was one of the things that I liked about it, is it's a reminder that even though these people aren't here with you physically, they're still here. And then I think, at least maybe this is just my personal experience, it gives me a little bit of solace.
Yeah.
Knowing that, okay, I'm gonna die someday and I'm gonna be buried or cremated or something. And I have no idea what that's gonna be like. Man, wouldn't it be great to be able to come back and spend the people that you're gonna leave behind? Wouldn't that be great to kind of come back and spend some time with them? And I think it was in the movie Coco where they did highlight this idea of death, and that you die 3 times. Once when your soul leaves your body, 2 when your body goes into the ground, and then 3 when nobody remembers who you are. And in Coco, the really big issue is, if nobody remembers him, then his spirit dies. And like, people would argue that's the saddest of all. Yeah, that sounds pretty sad. And so maybe that's gives a little bit of this different orientations towards death, and how the holiday is a little bit approached. I mean, death is eerie. And it can be kind of creepy. This is something that we don't know. Anybody who listens, I do say that, nobody's worshiping death during Día De Los Muertos. And people it's a celebration of life.
And it's a celebration that's lasted thousands of years, right? And so we know that this holiday isn't contemporary or even 100, 200, 300 years old, but these are celebrations and ways of communing with our loved ones for centuries and thousands of years.
Yeah, we should say that they look very different now than they probably did, thousands of years ago. And at the same time, I would argue that the roots are still there.
Yeah, and under colonialism, there's this process of transculturation that occurs with the church. And so what you see now, and the altares and the way that they look now, and the spaces that they happen, really happen with this colonial relationship. For better, that's just part of where we are today. And so my next question to you is, now that we've had some background on this holiday, and we understand how folks are celebrating not only in Latin America, but in spaces like the Midwest. And I do want to give a shout out to the title of these episodes, Borderlands and Beyond, because there is this connected community between the Midwest and South Texas with agricultural farm workers, and just our families being rooted in those 2 spaces now. And so we do commute between these 2 land spaces. So where do you see the holiday going from here? So we've talked about the past, the present, and I want to talk about the future. So where does this holiday go from here?
Well, before I get into that, I just want to say, I just want something that, you point out, this is a transculturation and the colonial period. And I think in the 60s and 70s, during the Chicano movement, people were looking for ways to, reclaim Chicano culture, reclaim Mexican American culture, to reinfuse some of the indigenous identity into these holidays, because of the, there was a long period of time where indigenous practices, people would say still are, indigenous practices were, really excluded and denigrated and thought of as like, prehistoric almost. and during the Chicano movement, as it relates to this, Dia de los Muertos became one avenue of the celebration of Chicano spirituality, of indigenous practices, of this reconnecting with a kind of lost past. So I want to, as we go into, and then so as we go into this question about the future, I'm going to quote the MC Mos Def. And he was asked a number of years ago about what was going on with hip hop and what was the future of hip hop. And in a nutshell, he responded, well, what's going on with us? And he was referring to to the Black community, but what was going on with us? And so I would pose kind of the same statement and saying, well, what's going on with us as a Latinx community or a Chicano community or Mexican American community? And if we look at what's going on with us, we will see those expressions in our art form and in our culture. And so it wouldn't surprise me if you saw some altares that were remembering people who had passed away as a result of the current pandemic, or some altares regarding people who have died in their migration journeys. I think we've already seen some altares that have covered that. You might see some altares for people who have died as a result of state violence or gun violence. And so I think, look at what people are going through, look at what we're going through as a community. And I think that's where we'll see what the future of the holiday looks like. And I mean, the other question might be, how mainstream are Latinos becoming? And how are we being included or excluded, or how influential are we in the creation and the shaping of US culture? And that's not something that's new. Latinos have been influential in US culture for a long time. And maybe what we're seeing now is another iteration of that. And you might have in kind of a superficial way, where you've got a lot of imagery and a lot of use of imagery just to kind of as decorative. And you may have some other folks who are really interested in the holiday and like, wow, yeah, I'd love to have a party with my grandparents once a year. That sounds really important or meaningful to me as I'm trying to grieve their loss, or I'm trying to remember the good times with them. I'm going to do that. Cool. So you might see, so I would say, some of those things.
Absolutely, man. And some of this, you mentioned the word, or you said the word superficial, and sometimes it seems like the holiday can get there when it's introduced in, Spanish classes without a lot of historical cultural context. And maybe they're just like painting sugar cookies or sugar skulls, things like that. And it's just
by that I meant,
it's a little at least for me, a little off-putting that it's become just sort of colors and a date where we get to have fun with somebody else's culture, but without recognizing like the origins and sort of the ancestral roots. But this is a holiday and a topic that we can go on hours and hours talking about the different elements about this holiday. So for folks who are looking to learn a bit more about the history or other aspects about the holiday, what are some resources that we can point them to that maybe they can read, watch documentaries, and get some more information on Dia de los Muertos beyond the superficial sort of way that maybe some people have taken this holiday? So where can we dive in a little bit deeper into the soul of this holiday?
Yeah, and I mean, the first book that I think is really the one that's the only one out there really that kind of gets at this topic exactly how we've been kind of discussing is Day of the Dead in the USA by Regina Marchi. She's also written some scholarly articles and a number of things about the holiday, but this was the book that I used a lot in my researches. And in there, she cites a bunch of people who have done a lot of antecedent work that she builds on. And so if you want to go down those those channels into the colonial history of of the holiday and how people in Guanajuato and Oaxaca, and how even kind of the tourist industry has kind of shaped some of the celebrations in Mexico. She's got sources that you can go down there. The way we've been talking about it, and in terms of its roots in the Chicano movement, its connection to the Southwest. She talks about how there are there's documentation of folks in the Southwest and South Texas, in Texas, who have since the 1890s who have been doing something on these days as it relates to Day of the Dead. So definitely has a lot of long history, and that was one of the things that really impressed me was, and you had this kind of gut that like this, I know the history, I know where this stuff came from in terms of, even if you want to say it's a Spanish, colonial influence holiday, or even if you want to say that, I understand, the history of this part of the world. I understand the migration patterns of this part of the world. And to tell me that nobody of Mexican ancestry celebrated Dia de los Muertos prior to 1960 or 1970 didn't make sense to me. And she doesn't go into it very much. She acknowledges that it's there. And then, as we've been talking about, says that the 60s and 70s was a really crucial time for these types of holidays and for Chicano and Latino culture in the United States because of the political movements that were going on at the time among different groups. So her book is great. I think that'd be a good, and it's an easy read. And you don't need to have a sociology background. You don't need to have an anthropology background. You don't even need to have a history background to get something out of the book. So awesome. Definitely look for her work if you're interested in learning more.
Awesome, man. Well, some of the things that we've highlighted during this plática is Dia de los Muertos as this holiday that helps us create a sense of place and a sense of being in the United States. It's something that we use to remember like who we are. Yeah. And there is this sort of misconception that it's a celebration of death, and I'm glad that we talked about how it's actually a celebration of life. And even those folks who aren't with us anymore, they get to sort of be in community with us, and so much of our existence is being part of community and being connected. And so I do want to sort of acknowledge that this Dia de los Muertos, it's going to be a little bit different, I think, just because we've been going through so much loss in the world.
Yeah.
We've lost real lives, real people to COVID-19. We've lost our sense of normalcy. Some people have lost jobs. Yeah. Some people have lost themselves just, internally. And so I think this Dia de los Muertos, there's going to be a lot of mourning in terms of like the world that we used to know, right? We used to know this world post or pre-COVID-19. And for a lot of us, we want to hang on to that. There's a sort of rally cry to like, we need to get back to normal. And normal was sort of devastating for a lot of people in our community. And so maybe, Dia de los Muertos can serve as one of those holidays or traditions, practices that we need to mourn the loss of our world. Do you have any do you have any thoughts on that process, or what COVID-19 might mean for these feelings and these real emotions that we have as human beings of like, we're mourning this loss, this huge loss.
I think the therapists in the world would say there's a sense of loss, and there's going to be a grieving process. And just like when somebody in your life passes away, there's a void there, and that takes time to heal. And right now we're still in the midst of that wound. We're still in the midst of that collective trauma here. So I think that's a really observant thing to say, and really, and again, like I said earlier, perhaps in the future we will see some altares that are dedicated to people, or maybe we're going to put people's pictures on our altares that passed away during this, during the pandemic. And I heard something on the news today that talked about Latinos have some of the highest infection rates in terms of ethnic communities. And so definitely it's impacting Latinos in a very profound way. And as you're talking about this, some of the things that that came to mind were in some of the articles that I read when it was talking about the colonial experience and the colonial experience that Dia de los Muertos comes out of. And there was a lot of death in the colonization of Mexico. There was a lot of death, either through some very direct violence or through diseases, and the pandemic of all of the diseases that came with the Europeans that indigenous peoples in the Americas had no immunities for. And one of I didn't recommend his work. His work is also very good. Stanley Brandis, who's an anthropologist from UC Berkeley. One of the things that he pointed out in one of his articles was during some of this colonial period, people were dying a lot, and indigenous people were dying at an incredible rate. And I don't even think saying an incredible rate gives it justice. I mean, people use the word, the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas, and I think that's what it was. And Dia de los Muertos comes out of that experience. And is this a way of processing and mourning these types of losses? The people that you really loved and who were here one day and aren't here another. And how do we as human beings process that? How do we as a cultural community, as a collective, how do we process these senses of loss?
Yeah, and I think that Craft Cultura is doing this this type of work where we're bridging, folks who are who are mental health experts with folks who are in, like myself, who are in education, folks like yourself, you're also an educator and in sort of the educational bubble, with artists and all these people, and we're all just trying to figure out what's going on. Like, how do we collectively heal? How do we get just through some of this, like the outcomes of colonialism? Like, we're literally living through the outcomes of a colonial structure that's built around us. And so as people with very little institutional power, we do have a lot of power within ourselves to tell our stories, to tell our narratives, to sort of have these discussions on Dia de los Muertos that other people might not be having these conversations outside of a curriculum or outside of the ivory tower. And so that's one of the really cool things about Craft Cultura, is that we're trying to sort of break out of these institutional walls to talk to one another and figure out, how do we best address the things that our community needs. And I think that Dia de los Muertos is one of those sort of holidays and times of the year where we can mourn together. We can literally like hold one another, even not literally holding one another, but I can hold you emotionally, I can hold you intellectually, I can hold you, authentically with who I am and seeing you for who you are. So I do want to thank you for enlightening us, man, and really coming to this plática with community in mind. I know that you don't do this work just to do it and just to be fancy and for kicks and giggles. Like you take this seriously, and I want to acknowledge that you really bring a lot of expertise, knowledge, and corazón. Like you literally bring a lot of corazón to the community, whether you're in Chicago, Wisconsin, when you come down to South Texas. Like siempre le echas ganas, le echas corazón. And so I want to give a shout out to you and thank you for being on today's episode, man. So if you want to say any last parting words, this is your time, man.
I want to say, well, there's two things that I wanted to say, and the first one left me. I want to say one thing is like while we're talking about mourning and holding each other, that this is a happy, you know, in Mexico it's a happy holiday. Like there's that it's this kind of dichotomy or this duality of emotions. You're sad that they're not there, and you feel kind of that weight, and at the same time you're also you're also happy, and you're celebrating the time that you did have. And so if anybody who listens to this says, you know, hey, I want to make a Dia de los Muertos altar this time around, and I want to do that, and there's probably going to be a little bit of sadness and some nostalgia that comes up, and there's also, yo, do you remember when Abuelito did this? Or, you know, do you remember when you know, grandma did that? Do you remember when grandma used to make these types of things? And so one of the things that I've tried to do as someone who comes from like a mixed cultural background is try to incorporate these types of things into the holiday as well. And so it's like, well, this is what grandma liked to make, so we're going to do what Yaya did, you know, and these types of things. The other thing I wanted to say, and I think it's really like that's why I continue to try to be involved in, you know, with and support Craft Cultura. I think it's really cool what everybody is doing and trying to kind of create a space for people to tell their stories outside of the quote unquote academy, because the academy is doing its own thing and it's doing its thing, and it has its role, but it's not the only role. And when I feels like forever ago, when I was an undergrad, I had the opportunity to see Rudy Acuña, who was one of like the founding historians of Chicano studies, speak. And afterwards, I was like, I have a book. I have his book, Occupied America, and you know, total fan. I'm gonna go get him to sign it. And so I pushed my way up, and of course, you know, he's a professor, and I'm, you know, an undergrad, and I was like, I have to have a question. And I said, you know, I want to do something. This is what I'm interested in. I want to do this for the community. I'm interested in these topics of, you know, race, culture, immigration, identity. Like, what are some things that I could do to? And in my mind, I was thinking, tell me how to be a professor like you is what I'm asking. And he turns around and he says, go work with and go work for the people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go work with the people, you go work for the people, you'll learn more about those things than you could ever imagine. And I was like, oh, I was expecting him to say, you know, read so-and-so, or, you know, you should really look at this article. And he just kind of says, go and do the work where the people are and work with the people. And that's been something that I've tried to do since that, and tried to figure out, I've tried to figure out how to do that since that day. Oh, and this is the other part. You brought up a really great piece with the mental health, and you said a lot of people in Craft Cultura are mental health professionals. And one of the things that I think we're seeing with, you know, Latinos is, as it comes from like a U.S. mental health focus, is that that's not always culturally relevant to us. Mm. And so perhaps, how do we, as more and more Latinos, as we become a bigger part of the United States, and as more and more of us get, you know, become therapists and counselors and teachers and doctors and all these different roles that we're all becoming, all these different opportunities that we're in, how do we do things in a way that makes sense for who we are? How do we do things in a culturally relevant way? We talked about Dia de los Muertos as like an art form, and this is a culturally relevant way of expression. And does Dia de los Muertos have a role in our mental health? Now we're talking about healing. How do you heal? How do you, what are some things that you're doing in order to heal? How do you, and perhaps building an altar and putting photos out and making food and putting the decorations out, maybe that's part of your grief and your healing process. And if it is, great. I think that's something that could be really powerful. And I know that I have a very small altar up with a couple of decorations, and that just kind of stays up all year. And I got one for my grandmother, one for my grandfather, and every now and you get to see them and you kind of go, hi.
Yeah, and that's really cool that you mentioned that, man, because like we've been presented with these like huge altares, and folks who may not be as familiar with Dia de los Muertos, you see this representation of Dia de los Muertos as like this grandiose event, and which it is in certain parts of Mexico, Latin America, certain parts of the US, but it doesn't have to be, right? And so just like you said, it could just be something very simple to honor the people that were important to you, the people who continue to be important to you. And so it doesn't have to be this huge elaborate thing. It can be, sus fotos, just, you know, some memories, a small little altar.
Yeah.
It's about, you know, you coming with that sense of respect and love for your community and your
Yeah.
loved ones. So it doesn't have to look all, you know, fancy.
Yeah.
It can, and those are we appreciate those as well.
Yeah.
But you know, like you said, you can have a little altar and hold your relatives in that way. And so I just want to
Yeah.
say to anybody watching who is part of the community, and you know, you have your role that you play within the community, whether you're an artist, whether you're an educator, a mental health advocate, or or you do something that, you know, isn't really being exposed. We would love to have you on one of these episodes and talk to you, gain your perspective. We want to hear your stories. You know, we're like I said, we don't have a whole lot of institutional power. We don't have a whole lot of seats in the Senate and Congress and this and that. But what we do have is we have ourselves, we have our stories, and our narratives have been helping us survive throughout, you know, over 500 years of colonialism. And so we do have a lot of power. We have family power, we have people power. And so I want to invite anybody watching, if you want to share your expertise, your work with the community, we would love to have you on one of these episodes. So, Will, again, thank you for all that you do for the community in Chicago and reaching out to us down here in South Texas. We look forward to seeing you at the next book club, because we also have a book club. So, look forward to seeing you there, buddy. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah. Thank you, man. Thank you. It's my pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for all of the, you know, the really kind things that you said today. And yeah, I look forward to continued involvement with, you know, with Crop Cultura. And post-pandemic, I look forward to coming down and visiting South Texas again.
Yes, sir.
And you know,
That'd be awesome.
getting to see it, everything now.
All right, man. Well, thanks again. And to everybody
Right.
at home, thank y'all for watching and
Take good
tuning
care.
in. And we'll see y'all at the next episode. Thank you.